Welcome to the Gemara on Chet Amud Bet. We're starting from the first Mishnah on the Amud. Ein ben mitzora musgar lemitzora muchlat ela priya uprima. There is no difference between a mitzora musgar, someone who is suspected of being a mitzora, has gone to the Kohen to be checked and is then shut up, sort of quarantined for 7 days, and a mitzora muchlat, someone who has been determined after the 7-day quarantine to for sure be a mitzora. The Kohen looked at him and said, yep, your blemish got worse, so you're definitely a mitzora. So there's no difference between the mitzora musgar, the maybe mitzora, and the mitzora muchlat, the for sure mitzora, except for priya and prima, except for the fact that in the case of the mitzora muchlat, he has to do priya, he has to have his hair grow out, and he has to tear his clothing. The muchlat has to do that, and not the musgar. Ein bein tahor mitoch hasger letahor mitoch hechlet ela tiglachat v'tzipurim. And there's no difference between someone who is purified from a state of being shut up for those 7 days, from a state of quarantine, and someone who becomes purified from a state of hechlet, from being for sure a mitzora, except for tiglachat and tzipurim, except for shaving and bringing 2 birds as a korban. The person who was a mitzora muchlat, the person who is being mitzaher from hechlet, who was for sure a mitzora, he has to bring these 2 birds and he has to shave all his hair. And the tahor mitoch hasker, the one who becomes purified after being quarantined for 7 days, they just say to him, oh no, you know what, you're actually not a mitzora. He doesn't have to bring those things. Here's the Gemara. Halinyan shiluach v'tum'ah zeh v'zeh shavin. It must be that with regard to shiluach, being sent outside the city, and tum'ah, and the level of impurity, these 2 are the same, meaning the 2 cases are the same. For those 2 things, both are sent outside the city, and both are equally ritually impure. Minahani mile, from where are these words? Now, there are 2 cases in the Mishnah, so in order to know what exactly the question is here, and I'll put the question in red. So in order to understand what the question is exactly, I brought you Rashi. Minahani mile de'in priya ufrima b'musgar. How do we know that there is no priya ufrima with a mitzora musgar? How do we know that with the person who was just quarantined for 7 days but not confirmed as a mitzora, how do we know that he doesn't need priya ufrima? Dilma galilan rachmana b'muchlat v'hu hadin l'musgar k'da amart le'inyan tuma. Maybe, perhaps, galilan rachmana, God or the Torah revealed it to us with regard to a muchlat, with regard to someone who's for sure a mitzora. V'hu hadin, but it's also the rule, it's also the law for a musgar, for someone who's just shut up for the 7 days, kedamar linyan tuma, as we're going to say with the matter of tuma. In other words, the laws of mitzora span 2 chapters, and sometimes it'll tell us, the Torah will tell us something about one case and not about the other, but we learn out somehow that it applies to both. So why not say that priya ufrima applies to both? Why say that it only applies to the muchlat? So how do we know this, right? How do we know that it only applies to the muchlat and not the musgar? Titani Rav Shmuel bar Yitzchak Hamed Rav Huna, because Rav Shmuel bar Yitzchak taught before Rav Huna from the pasuk in Vayikra Yud Gimel Vav, V'tiaro hakohen mispachat hi v'chabes begadav v'taher. So this pasuk, the kohen purifies him from his blemish. It's just a blemish, and he immerses his clothing in himself, or he immerses his clothing and he becomes purified. So this means tahor mi priya prima demi ikara. He is purified from priya and prima from the very beginning, meaning it says there taher, not yitar. So he's pure. Again, I'll turn to Rashi over here. B'mitzora sheba lichal tahara mitoch hizkiro v'lo nichla k'tiv v'seifet zikra k'tiv v'chabes begadav v'taher. So this is the part I want you to focus on. It says v'taher. Midolo katav vayitar lishna demi karahu. Since it doesn't say vayitar, he will become purified, right? It could have said he does these things and then he becomes purified. But it says v'taher, he is already pure. Lishna demikara, this is a language of originally or from the beginning, meaning the musgar, it was like we made a mistake almost, right? He was shut up for 7 days, but it turns out he doesn't really have tzarat, not so much so that we then say, he has to stay locked up, he has to stay until he's tahor. He's tahor right now, and that means that he was never, there was never a problem such that he needed priya or prima for the muskar. That's just not the way we ever would have applied the tuma to him. So initially, lechatchila, he wasn't chayav in priya or prima because he didn't really have this problem. According to Rav Shmuel Bar Yitzchak, this is the source. This pasuk is the source for how we know that there's no difference regarding priya or prima regarding this first case in the Mishnah. That's how we know that priya or prima only applies to the muchlat and not the muskar. Amar li Rava. Rava says back to him, or to him in response to this teaching. El me'ata gabe zav tichtiv v'chibes begadav v'taher. Put that in yellow because it's a verse. Hata mai v'taher. Mai v'taher me'ikara ika. Ela Torah. Okay, I'm going to stop there for a second. So Rava says, but from here, meaning according to your logic, regarding zav, it says v'chibes begadav v'taher. Basically the same exact words. He's going to wash his clothing and become purified. So there also the taher is in the present, not vayitar in the future. Hata mai v'taher me'ikara ika. There, what can you say was pure initially? In other words, can you apply your same logic of how you interpret this verse of v'taher regarding a mitzvah? Can you apply the same logic to a zav? Because it says exactly the same thing. So there also you're going to say there was something about him that was less tameh from the beginning. We wouldn't say that about a zav. So he's basically questioning Rav Shmuel Bar Yitzchak's logic with regard to this verse. Ela tahor hashta mila tamei kli cheres beheset. Rather, what this v'taher means is he's tahor now. The tahara kicks in now and prevents him from being mitameh earthenware vessels beheset by moving them. This is a law with regard to a zav. He has a special kind of tuma that he can transmit. He can transmit tuma to earthenware vessels just by moving them around. And a zav is allowed to go to the mikveh after 7 days. He's allowed to go to the mikveh actually on the 7th day. So potentially it could happen that he would go to the mikveh on day 7, and then go around touching things and sitting on things and things like that. And then he sees another emission, again, still within the 7th day. Let's say he went to the mikveh at 11 a.m. and now it's 2 p.m. and he sees another zav, so that kind of messes up his zav count. He's going to have to start counting the 7 days from the beginning, even though he already went to the mikveh. So, afal gav dehadar chazi lo mitameh l'mafreya. Even though he Hadar is Chazar, he goes back and sees, meaning he sees again, he sees another emission on day 7, he does not make things tameh l'mafreya with regard to Heset. He doesn't retroactively make things tameh. So in this case where he went to the mikveh at 11 a.m., and then he touched all sorts of things, and then he sees another emission at 2 p.m., those things that he touched, that he moved, that he lifted between 11 a.m. and 2 p.m., don't become tameh retroactively, because at that time he thought he was totally in the clear. He thought he was done with his zav. He'd counted his 7 days, he'd gotten to the mikveh, but the 7th day wasn't quite over. So even though he's going to have to go back and count again after seeing this emission on day 7, he didn't make things tameh beheset by lifting them, l'mafreya. So hachanami tahor hashim l'tameh b'biya l'mafreya. So too, this is Rava's argument. So too, with regards to hashta is now or here, with regards to a mitzvah, he's tahor, he's purified from being able to be matame with entering a house to create that tumah retroactively, because the special kind of tumah that a mitzvah has is that he can transmit tumah to a house just by entering it, to everything in the house. So again, same deal. What if he went to the mikveh already, but then the tzarat comes back? So in that interim time, he didn't cause tumah. We don't go back and say, oh, since now we realize that 2 hours ago you were tameh, every house that you went into, everything becomes tameh. So in other words, that v'taher phrase, argues Rava, doesn't actually have anything to do with priya or frima. For a zav, it means he doesn't cause retroactive tumah for Tumat Heset, and therefore for a Mitzvah, it means he doesn't cause retroactive Tuma for Tumat Biyah, for coming into a house. So he's sort of destroyed Rav Shmuel Bar Yitzchak's argument that this Vitzaher means, is what tells us that he's purified, that he didn't ever have to do Priya or Prima, so we still don't have a good answer. He killed the answer to the question of Menah Hanimila, we still don't have an answer. So Rava is going to suggest an alternative answer. Ella Amar Rava. Rather, Rava says, Ella Amar Rava Mehacha. Rather, Rava says it from here. Vehatzarua asher bo hanega. This pasuk, Yud Gimel Mem He in Vayikra. So the tsarua, the person with tzarat who has the nega, who has the blemish, misha tzaratot tzuya begufo, yatsa ze she'ein tzaratot tzuya begufo. So this refers only to the person whose tzarat is dependent on his body, and excludes the one whose tzarat is not dependent on his body. In other words, the one who has tzarat dependent on his body, that's a mitzvah muchlat. He's been totally decided to be a mitzvah, and the only thing that can make him get over that status is for his body to get better. Whereas the muskar, it's not that his body really made him a mitzvah yet. The Kohen looked at it and said, you have to be shut up for 7 days. So his tzarat is tluya not begufo, but biyamim. El biyamim, period. It says that she'ein tzaratot tluya begufo, el biyamim. So the person with tzarat that is dependent on his body, meaning the muchlat, he is the one who has priya frima, not the one whose tzarat is dependent on just a set number of days, which is the muskar. That's Rava's answer, meaning this is Rava's answer to this question. Moving on, Amar le Abaye. Abaye said, Ela me'ata. Rather, from there, meaning from now, right, according to your reasoning, Kol yamei asher hanega bo yitama. This pasuk, all the days that this nega, this blemish is upon him, he will be impure. Misha tzaratot tluya begufo, hu t'ta'un shiluach. V'she'ein tzaratot tluya begufo, ein ta'un shiluach. One whose tzarat is dependent on his body, he's the one who requires being sent away, and one whose tzarat is not dependent on his body doesn't require shiluach. Meaning Abaye is saying, okay, but if you apply your logic, then the continuation of the pasuk you quoted, right, the very next pasuk says, all the days that the nega is upon him, he's going to be impure. So that, again, if we extend your logic, Rava, then only people where the tzarat is dependent on their body get sent away, and people whose tzarat is just dependent on counting a number of days, they're not going to get sent away, and that's going to contradict the Mishnah. V'chi tema, the Gemara is going to play that out for you. And if you would say, hachinami, sure, okay, fine. Literally, so too, meaning go for it. Let's say that only the muchlat gets sent away, not the muskar. The hakatani, but didn't we learn in the Mishnah, ein bein mitzvah muskar la mitzvah muchlat ela priya frima? We learned that there's actually no difference between the muskar and the muchlat except for priya frima, which means that they both get sent away. Halinyan shiluach u'etzmuye bevia zev v'zeh shavin, which means that when it comes to shiluach, getting sent away, and making things tameh by entering a house, the two are equal. So Abaye basically says to Rava, your argument is not going to work at all. Meaning your answer, I'm rejecting your answer. Amar le, so he says back to him, yemei, this word, yemei, right, over here, and kol yemei, which is actually what it says in the pasuk, l'rabot mitzvah muskar v'shiluach. Rava says no. Yemei, if the pasuk just said yemei, it would be like you said. But kol yemei, all the days, that word kol comes to include mitzvah muskar, to be sent away. So Rava basically says to Abaye, I reject your rejection, and my answer still stands. Now, this next part of the Gemara, I'm going to read, but then I'm going to correct. And I'm going to do a line break here just to make it a little bit clearer. Here, put this in yellow so you'll know that these are psukim. Okay. So what it says here is Ihachi tiglachat v'tzipurim my taima lo. If so, tiglachat and tzipurim, shaving and birds, what is the reason not? That's the literal translation. In fact, when we look at this in class, we'll see that the Bach here, Rav Yoel Circus, the Haggahoda Bach, who corrects things on the Daf of Gemara, corrects these words and says we're actually not continuing the argument. Ihachi means if so, and it sort of implies let's just continue the conversation. But according to the Bach, that's not actually what's going on here. And what's actually going on here is that we're moving on to the second part of the Mishnah. So remember, the second part of the Mishnah talks specifically about the tahara process for these two cases, for the musgar and the mukhlat, and says that the only difference is tiglachat and sipurim. So the Bach says you should sort of put in here, you should pretend that there's like a colon at the end of these words. Whoops. And here we start with, ella tiglachat, the tzipurim. You should pretend that that quote from the Mishnah gets introduced here, and you can really take out the words ihachi. That doesn't really belong here at all. And it's just the Gemara now asking about tiglachat v'tzipurim my time alo. So the question is, basically, what's the difference, or why is it that the musgar doesn't have to do the shaving and bringing the birds? Diktani, as we learned in the Mishnah, ein bein tahor mitoch hasger l'tahor mitoch echlat ela tiglachat v'tzipurim. So again, the Bach doesn't really need this part, right? Because we're already talking about this quote. Amar Abaye. So Abaye says, Amar Kra, the pasuk says, Vayetzeh kohen al michutz ha'machaneh, v'hina nirpa nega hatzarat. The kohen goes outside of the camp, right outside of the city, and he sees that the nega hatzarat has become healed. Mishatzaratot tluya b'refuot. This applies only to a person whose tzarat is dependent on refuot, on becoming better. Yatzazeh she'ein tzaratot tluya b'refuot ela b'yamim. So that excludes one whose tzarat isn't dependent on getting better, but is just dependent on waiting the 7 days. So here we see the distinction. If you read the pasuk Abaye's way, you see the distinction between the muskar, that's the one who's just locked up for 7 days, so his tzarat is tluya b'yamim, is dependent on waiting 7 days, versus the mukhlat, whose tzarat is dependent on refuot, on getting better. So at the end of this Gemara, we have a source, we have a pasuk that is the source for each part of the Mishnah. For the first part of the Mishnah, in ben mitzvah musgar mitzvah mukhlat ela priya ufrima, our source is going to be the one that Rava quotes, not v'chibes begadav v'taher, but rather v'hatzerua asher bo hanega. This is going to be the winning source, because Rava is able to defend his answer from an attack. And the second part of the Mishnah, we only have one proposed answer for what the source is, and that's v'yatzah koel michutz ha'machaneh v'hina nirpa nega hatzarat. So your questions for homework are going to be to go through the psukim and just make sure you understand what each person is learning from each pasuk. So sometimes there are multiple conflicting things that are being learned from each pasuk. Make sure you understand. That's question number one. And question number two is just in your own words, summarize the conclusion of this Gemara. We'll stop here.